Her small act of courage during a flood 12 years ago was supposed to stay buried. Instead, it walked back into her life wearing a tailored suit, flanked by armed men, and bowed to her in front of the husband who called her nothing. "Little sister," he said, "I finally found you." And just like that, the maid everyone laughed at became the woman an empire refused to touch. Before we go further, if you believe kindness should never be punished, hit subscribe right now. Derek humiliated the woman who gave everything and asked for nothing. Don't be like him. Like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Would you have stayed quiet as long as Amara did? Only the cold-hearted scroll past. Amara Chidi had learned, over 7 years of pushing a linen cart through the polished halls of the Sovereign Crest Hotel, that going unnoticed was its own kind of armor. You stopped feeling the sting in your shoulders. You stopped hearing the word "only" attached to your job title. Only housekeeping, only staff, only the help. You learned to smile at guests who stared past you like you were part of the wallpaper. What she never managed to stop feeling was her husband's voice doing the exact same thing. "Slow down, Amara. You're in the Whitfield's way," Derek Voss said that morning, not even turning to look at her as he straightened his collar in the lobby mirror. He said her name the way you'd say a stranger's, not a wife's. 7 years of marriage had worn that promise down to something brittle, like a hinge nobody bothered to oil anymore. Amara didn't answer. She'd learned that too. Silence cost her less than arguing ever did. She wheeled her cart toward the service elevator, past the front desk, where 2 junior clerks were laughing at something on a screen. She caught her reflection in the steel doors. 39 years old, braids pinned back, uniform pressed sharp, because dignity was the one thing Derek hadn't managed to take from her yet. Behind her, she heard him chuckling with a guest. That warm, easy laugh he reserved for people who mattered. She used to believe she mattered too. Somewhere around year 4, she'd lost track of exactly when that stopped being true. The elevator chimed. She stepped inside, and for one unguarded second, her hand drifted to the worn cord bracelet still knotted at her wrist, tucked beneath her sleeve. A habit older than her marriage, older than this hotel. She barely remembered the boy's face anymore. Just his trembling hands, the smell of river mud and diesel, and the sound of her own voice, humming lullabies to keep him from crying while the water kept rising. She wondered sometimes whether he'd survived at all, or whether the bracelet was just something to hold on to when the noise in her head got too loud. She had no way of knowing that 3 miles away, in a glass-walled office on the 40th floor of a tower that made grown executives straighten their ties, a man was rereading her personnel file for the 4th time that hour. Ren Teke did not fidget. He did not raise his voice. In 12 years of building an empire out of other men's caution, he had trained every visible nerve out of his body, except one. His thumb kept drifting back to the photograph clipped to the front page. A tired woman in a housekeeping uniform, badge number 3390, employed since 2017. "Verify it," he said without lifting his eyes. His head of security, a heavy-set man named Okada, who had watched his boss unmake rival organizations without so much as a blink, cleared his throat. "Sir, the acquisition finalizes at 1 o'clock. If you go to the property before the paperwork clears." "Verify it," Takeda said again, quieter this time, which somehow landed harder. Okada confirmed it. Amara Chidi, listed volunteer, Coastal Relief Corps, flood response, 12 years prior. Current address, staff housing, 4 blocks from the Sovereign Crest. Takeda closed the file. He thought of a river swallowing a village whole, and a girl, barely 23, wedging her body between him and the current like she had nothing left to lose, because she'd already lost everything, and chosen to spend what remained on a stranger's son. He thought of the bracelet he had never once removed in 12 years, hidden beneath his watch, beneath cufflinks worth more than most people's cars. He had come to this city to absorb a hotel group whole. Punishment for a wage theft scandal his people had traced back through a shell company. Nothing personal. Strictly business. He hadn't expected business to hand him back the one debt money could never settle. "Ready the convoy," he said, "and learn everything about her life here. Everything." By 1 o'clock, 3 black sedans were gliding toward the Sovereign Crest's entrance. Inside the lobby, a maid named Amara Chidi was calmly asking the front desk to prepare the penthouse suite, because, she said, her brother was arriving. Derek Voss laughed so hard he had to grip the counter for balance. He would not be laughing much longer. The doors of the Sovereign Crest didn't open so much as give way. 5 men in dark suits entered first, spreading through the lobby with the unhurried certainty of men who had done this in 100 lobbies before this one. Guests froze mid-conversation. A porter dropped a garment bag. Derek, still wiping tears of laughter from his eyes, straightened his jacket on reflex, already loading up the smile he kept for VIPs. Then Ren Takeda stepped through the doors, and the air in the room changed. He wasn't the tallest man there, or the loudest. He didn't need to be. He moved like pressure dropping before a storm, the kind you don't argue with, only brace for. His suit was tailored so precisely it looked less like clothing and more like a second skin. His eyes swept the room once, passing over the crystal fixtures, the marble floor, the manager already scrambling forward with an outstretched hand. Taka walked past all of it. Past the manager. Past Derek. Past decades of other people's assumptions about who was worth seeing. He stopped in front of Amara. For a moment, nobody breathed. Amara stood frozen beside her cart, badge 3390 catching the light, hands still smelling of citrus cleaner. She didn't recognize him. How could she? The boy in her memory had sunken cheeks and a child's terror in his eyes. This man had a jaw like carved stone, and a stillness that made trained bodyguards look away first. Then he bowed, not a nod. A full, deliberate bow, the kind reserved for elders, for debts no currency could ever repay. "Little sister," he said in careful English, "I finally found you." His hand lifted, just enough to reveal the frayed cord at his own wrist, hidden for 12 years beneath watches worth more than the hotel's monthly payroll. Amara's breath caught. Her fingers found the matching bracelet at her own wrist without permission from her brain. Muscle memory older than her marriage, older than this uniform. "The boy," she whispered. "The river." "You," her voice cracked on the last word because saying it out loud made 12 years of not knowing collapse all at once. "I lived," he said simply, "because of you." Behind her, Derek made a sound that might have been a laugh trying to survive contact with reality and failing. This has to be some kind of prank. Amara doesn't have a brother. She's staff. He said the word like it explained everything, like it was a shield. Takeda's eyes moved to him for the first time, slowly, the way a man might study an insect he hadn't yet decided was worth stepping on. "You are her husband," Takeda said. It wasn't a question. Somewhere in that 40th floor office, a file already existed with Derek's name on it, cross-referenced against payroll records that hadn't finished loading. "Derek Voss, front of house supervisor," Derek said, chest puffing slightly, already recalculating whether this stranger's money was a threat or an opportunity. Amara watched the gears turning behind his eyes, and felt something old and tired settle deeper in her chest, even now, even standing right here. "I see," Takeda said, and those two words carried more weight than a verdict read aloud. He turned back to Amara, and something in his face eased. Not weakness, but the rare gentleness only the truly dangerous can afford to show. "You held a stranger's son together for 6 hours in the dark and asked for nothing in return. I have spent 12 years and more money than this hotel is worth searching for you. So I could finally ask, what do you need? Name it." The lobby had gone so silent the elevator chime sounded like a gunshot. Amara opened her mouth, closed it. In 7 years at this hotel, no one had ever asked her that question. Not the guests, not management, not the man standing 3 feet away wearing her husband's name like a costume he'd forgotten to take off. She didn't know how to answer something that large. Not yet. Not with her hands still trembling and cleaner still under her nails. "I need," she said slowly, "someone to tell me this is actually happening." Takeda almost smiled. "Okada," he said without turning, "pull the acquisition records. I want to know exactly who has been authorizing this woman's pay for the last 4 years. Derek's confident posture flickered. Barely. Just enough for Amara to notice. The way you notice a hairline crack in glass, right before it shatters. He had no idea yet how much was about to spill out of that crack. Shame has a smell, Amara thought later. So does guilt. And apparently, so does a man's composure collapsing in real time. It smelled like the drugstore cologne Derek oversprayed whenever he was nervous, thickening in the recycled lobby air as Okada's team set up a folding table near the front desk like they were preparing for surgery. In a way, they were. "This isn't necessary," Derek said, his voice climbing half an octave above the register he used with guests. "Whatever this is, a misunderstanding, a stunt for a camera crew, I don't know. There's no reason to drag payroll into the lobby." "Payroll," Takeda repeated, tasting the word like it had gone bad. He hadn't raised his voice once. He didn't need to. The room had already made itself his audience. Phones lowering, breath held, the particular hush that only exists right before something breaks open. "Interesting that you jumped straight to payroll. I only asked who authorized it." A laptop opened. Okada's fingers moved with the calm precision of a technician who had done this before and would do it again without losing sleep. Amara stood beside her cart, arms folded against a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, watching numbers scroll past that were supposed to represent her life, and somehow didn't add up to anything she recognized. "Overtime differential," Okada read aloud, flat and unhurried. "Authorized monthly. Routed to account ending 7215. He looked up. "Ms. Shidi, is this your account?" Amara shook her head slowly. She'd never seen that number in her life. That's mine, Derek said too fast, then caught himself. I mean, we pool our finances. Married people do that. It's completely normal. For 4 years, Okada continued unbothered. Overtime differentials totaling roughly $19,000 were diverted from Ms. Chitty's earnings into an account you control, coinciding with, he scrolled, expression unchanged, which somehow made it worse. 7 separate charges at the Crown Vista Sportsbook on the same or adjacent dates. The lobby, already silent, now reached something closer to reverence. Amara felt the floor tilt slightly. The particular vertigo of discovering that the version of your life you'd been quietly mourning wasn't even the full story. She'd noticed the gaps in her paychecks over the years. Of course she had. She wasn't foolish. She'd simply been too tired, too outmatched, too used to being told she'd counted wrong, misread the stub, misremembered the total. Derek had a gift for making his wife doubt her own math. It turned out that gift had a price tag, and she'd been the one covering it. "You stole from me," she said. Not a question. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Steadier than 7 years of swallowed anger had any right to sound. "I was going to put it back," Derek said, and even he seemed to hear how flimsy that sounded once it left his mouth and hit open air. It was a rough stretch. Everybody has rough stretches. You don't understand what it's like, trying to look successful when your wife is... He stopped himself half a beat too late. "When your wife is what?" Takeda asked, and for the first time, something dangerous stirred beneath his calm, like current under still water. Derek said nothing. He didn't need to. The word had been sitting in his mouth for 7 years, and everyone in that lobby had heard it in his tone often enough, even if never quite in his words, to fill in the blank themselves. Tekka turned to Amara. "There's more," he said gently now, the gentleness somehow more unsettling than his anger would have been. "Camera footage. 18 months of it. I'd rather you view it privately, sister, than let it become entertainment for people who've already entertained themselves at your expense enough for one lifetime." Amara looked at Derek. Really looked. The way you study a stranger's photograph, trying to place a face you used to love. She thought of every only staff, every dismissive wave of his hand in front of guests. Every night she came home aching to an empty stove because he'd assumed she'd handle it. She always handled it. "Show me," she said. "All of it. I've spent 7 years not asking questions I already knew the answers to. I'm finished doing that." Somewhere near the elevators, the hotel manager, sensing the precise moment his career began quietly dying, reached for his phone to call corporate, only to find 4 missed calls already waiting, from a number he didn't recognize, all traced to the 40th floor that, as of 1 o'clock that afternoon, technically owned him. The manager's office wasn't built for a crowd this size, but Takada's men made it work, dragging in extra chairs, lowering blinds that had probably never once been closed during business hours. Amara sat with her hands folded in her lap, the posture of a woman who'd learned long ago that stillness cost less than flinching. Derek hovered near the door like a man calculating exits, though everyone in the room understood there weren't any left for him. Okada cued the footage on the office monitor. Time-stamped, dated, methodical. 14 months compressed into the parts that mattered. The first clip showed Amara, 16 months earlier, cleaning the 12th floor executive wing alone at 3 a.m. because Derek had forgotten to schedule a second housekeeper for a wing that required 2 under hotel policy, a policy he himself had signed off on in writing the week before. She'd worked the shift solo rather than leave a guest room unfinished, clocked out at 5 a.m., and been back at the desk by 9, because Derek needed her to cover so he could take a long lunch with a woman from regional sales who was not... Amara now understood watching his face on the monitor, discussing quarterly numbers. The second clip landed smaller, but somehow heavier. A guest's diamond bracelet had gone missing from a room Amara had cleaned. Derek, on camera, in the manager's own office, suggesting unprompted, helpfully, generously, that perhaps housekeeping ought to be searched. Amara had been pulled aside, patted down in a stairwell while coworkers watched, humiliated in front of people she saw every day. The bracelet turned up 3 weeks later in a drawer in Derek's own office where he'd apparently pocketed it himself and forgotten, too consumed with protecting his own image to remember the far simpler crime he'd actually committed. Amara didn't cry. She'd expected to, somewhere in the pit of her stomach, but what rose instead was something quieter and colder. The specific, clarifying anger of finally being handed proof for a suspicion she'd spent years being told was paranoia. "Enough," she said, and Okada paused the footage without needing to be asked twice. Derek had gone very pale. "Amara, baby, I can explain every..." "Don't," she said. Just that one syllable did more work than a shouted paragraph could have. Takeda hadn't moved from his spot by the window the entire time, watching not the screen but his sister's face. cataloging every flicker of pain like a debt he intended to collect on her behalf. "There's a decision in front of you," he said finally. "As of this afternoon, my company owns this hotel and 14 others in the group. I could remove him within the hour. I could make certain he never works in hospitality again on this continent. I could make his name mean something ugly, in rooms he'll never even know he was discussed in." Derek's face drained further at the casual, almost administrative ease with which Taka described unmaking a life. But Takeda continued, "This isn't my decision to make, it's yours. You're the one who spent 7 years absorbing what he handed out. Whatever justice looks like, sister, I'll build it to your exact specifications." Every eye in the room turned to Amara. She thought of Auntie Blessing, the seamstress who taught her that patience wasn't the same thing as surrender, that you could hold your tongue and still be sharpening something underneath it. She thought of 6 hours in rising water with a terrified boy, offering him the one thing she had, not vengeance, but a bracelet and a lullaby to keep his mind off the current. "I don't want him ruined," she said slowly, and watched surprise ripple through the room. Watched Derek's shoulders sag half an inch with something that might have been relief. "I want him standing when everyone finds out exactly what he is. Ruin is fast. People forget a scandal in 6 months. I want something that lasts longer than that." Takeda tilted his head, genuinely curious now, the closest thing to delight his carefully guarded face had shown all day. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "And then, sister, tell me how I can help you build it." Outside the office door, the hotel manager was already drafting his resignation letter, unsure whether he was about to be fired or simply hadn't been told the timing yet. "I want him retrained from the ground up," Amara said. The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before it. Not shock exactly, but recalibration. The sound of a room realizing it had underestimated the woman at its center twice in one afternoon. Derek's head snapped up. "What?" "Not as a supervisor," Amara continued, and now something had entered her voice that hadn't been there in 7 years of marriage. A kind of quiet command. The tone of a woman who had spent her whole life being talked over and had just discovered she no longer needed permission to speak first. Full rotation through every department, starting with laundry, under a manager who reports directly to the foundation. "If my brother is offering me influence here, I intend to use it." Takeda's mouth did something that on a less disciplined face would have been a smirk. "I was going to offer you the regional directorship of guest operations, but your proposal has considerably more edge." "Amara, you can't be serious," Derek said, color returning to his face in the specific shade of a man who thought the worst had already passed. "I have a reputation in this industry. Folding towels? That's not who I am." "Exactly who you are is up for debate," Amara said, cutting through him with the ease of a woman snapping a fitted sheet flat. "You've just never had to prove it with your hands before. Consider this your promotion into honesty." Takeda raised a hand, and Okada produced a fresh folder. Thinner. Cleaner. Evidently prepared in the 20 minutes since Amara had started talking, which told her exactly how many contingencies this man kept ready at all times. "There's a second option," Takeda said. "Full restitution of every stolen dollar, repaid over 24 months, garnished directly from whatever position he holds. Public disclosure to ownership. Permanent removal from any supervisory role across the group. And a criminal referral held in reserve. Not filed, but drafted, dated, and sitting in a drawer with my signature on it. If he ever raises his voice to you again, sister, it stops sitting in that drawer." Derek looked between them, his wife, and the stranger who had walked into his lobby that afternoon and, in the space of 3 hours, rearranged the entire architecture of his life, and understood, perhaps for the first time with total clarity, that there was no version of this conversation where he emerged as anything but smaller. "I'll sign it," he said quietly. Not because he'd found humility, but because he'd finally run out of rooms to run to. Okada slid the papers across the desk. Derek's hand shook slightly as he signed, a small, petty tremor Amara noted with the same detachment she'd once reserved for an unreasonable room service complaint. She wasn't cruel enough to enjoy it, but she wasn't foolish enough to pretend it didn't feel, in some small private corner of herself, like the first full breath she'd taken in years. Word moved through the hotel faster than any memo corporate could have drafted. By the time Amara and Takeda stepped back into the lobby, the crowd that had laughed at her that morning had rearranged itself into something closer to a congregation. Junior staff standing a little straighter. The clerk who'd been snickering earlier, now suddenly fascinated by his own shoes. Guests whispering behind raised hands about the maid who turned out to have a powerful brother. As if the story were gossip, and not, in fact, the exact moment their entire understanding of who deserved respect had been forcibly corrected. "There's something else," Takeda said quietly, once they were alone by the window overlooking the valet stand, the sedans still idling outside like patient dogs. "Something I never told you. because I didn't know how to say it without sounding like I was trying to buy back 12 years I could never actually purchase. Amara turned to him, and for the first time all day, she saw not the businessman the whole city flinched at, but the boy behind the trembling hands, waiting for the water to stop rising. "There's a fund," he said. "It's been running for 7 years. Scholarships, medical grants, shelters across 4 countries. Funded entirely by me." He paused, and something in his jaw tightened, the closest thing to vulnerability she'd seen from him since he walked through those doors. "It's registered under your name. I didn't know if I'd ever find you to tell you that. I just knew I couldn't let what you gave me disappear into nothing." Amara's hand found the bracelet at her wrist without permission, the same gesture it had made 1,000 times over 12 years. Except this time, it wasn't asking a question. It was answering one. Amara didn't sleep that night, not from grief this time, from the strange, disorienting weightlessness of a life recalculating itself in real time. The way a room feels different after you've moved the furniture, even though nothing structural has actually changed. She went home to the small staff apartment 4 blocks from the hotel. Home, though the word suddenly felt negotiable. And sat at her kitchen table with a tablet Okada had couriered over that evening, holding 7 years of fun records she hadn't known existed. She scrolled through them slowly, the way you'd walk through a house you'd been told you owned, but had never once visited. The Chitty Teketa Fund for River Children. Her name first, which she noted with a small, disbelieving laugh into the empty apartment. Scholarships awarded to 260 students across 3 countries. Kids pulled out of exactly the kind of hardship that had once left a frightened boy alone in floodwater with nothing but his own shaking hands. Medical grants. A shelter in Osaka with her name on a plaque she'd never seen. In a building she'd never visited. Funded by a brother she'd spent 12 years assuming had drowned. There was a video file near the bottom of the folder, dated 9 months earlier. She clicked it before she could talk herself out of it. It was Takeda, seated in what looked like the same 40th floor office she'd later come to know, recording what was clearly meant to be a message for a version of her he wasn't sure he'd ever find. "If you're watching this," he said, in the same careful English, "it means I finally found you, and I don't know yet whether you'll forgive me for taking so long. I want you to know that everything good I built because a stranger decided a frightened boy was worth 6 hours of her life. I've spent 12 years trying to become someone worth that decision." Amara closed the tablet and sat in the dark for a long time. The next morning, the Sovereign Crest looked different, though the marble hadn't changed and the chandeliers still hung exactly where they always had. What had shifted was smaller and larger than that. The way the front desk clerk greeted her by name instead of by function. The way junior staff who used to avoid eye contact now held it a beat too long. Unsure whether deference or friendliness was the correct register for a woman who'd apparently been quietly important the entire time. Derek was already in the basement laundry room when she arrived, dressed in a uniform 2 sizes too crisp looking for the work, folding towels with the stiff, unpracticed posture of a man discovering that fabric has a weight and a rhythm he'd spent 7 years assuming were beneath him. He didn't look up as she passed. She didn't make him. This is the part where you get to decide something too. Derek spent 7 years treating decency like weakness, because he assumed no one was keeping score. If you believe respect should never depend on someone's job title, hit subscribe and drop a comment below. Because the moment you stay quiet about people like Derek, you're teaching them they were right all along. Only the ones who've done the mocking themselves stay silent now. By mid-afternoon, Takeda found her on the rooftop garden where staff took their breaks, looking out over a skyline that had, in the space of a single day, become considerably more complicated than it used to be. "There's a board seat," he said, joining her at the railing. "Not a courtesy title. Real authority over hiring, wages, working conditions across the whole group. I want people like you deciding what people like you deserve. I'm tired of building things that only protect people who already have protection." Amara considered the offer the way she considered most things now. Slowly, with the specific caution of a woman who'd learned the hard way what happens when you accept things too quickly. "On one condition," she said, "the scholarship program expands. I want it reaching kids exactly like the boy in that river. The ones nobody's looking for yet." Takeda smiled, and for a moment the businessman disappeared entirely, replaced by something simpler and truer underneath. "Sister," he said, "I would have agreed to anything. You just made it easy." Below them, on the 12th floor, Derek finished folding a stack of towels with hands that had never done real work in 7 years, and understood, with the particular clarity that only humiliation provides, exactly how much he had thrown away, and exactly how little chance he had of ever getting it back. 7 months later, the lobby of the Sovereign Crest looked almost the same. Same marble. Same chandeliers throwing the same warm light across the same polished floors. But almost is a word that carries a great deal of weight once you know what to look for. There was a new plaque near the front desk now, small and unshowy, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. in honor of the staff who keep this place running. Seen and unseen, Amara had insisted on unshowy. Takeda had wanted brass and marble. They'd compromised, the way family does, on something that said everything without saying too much. Amara no longer pushed a cart, though she still visited the 12th floor most weeks, not out of obligation but out of a stubborn, sentimental refusal to let a title erase the woman she'd been while earning it. As regional director of guest operations and standing board member of the Chitty Takeda Fund, her signature now appeared on wage policies, on safety protocols, on the kind of paperwork that used to be signed only by people who'd never once cleaned a room themselves. Under her authority, overtime pay was audited quarterly by an outside firm. No supervisor could touch an employee's compensation without 3 layers of sign-off. She had built, brick by administrative brick, a version of the system that would have caught Derek on his very first attempt, instead of letting him run for 4 quiet years. Derek still worked at the hotel. That part of the arrangement, at Amara's insistence, had never changed. He'd lasted 5 months in laundry before requesting a transfer to the loading dock, which she'd approved without comment, and where he now spent his days hauling crates with the particular hunched diligence of a man who had finally, belatedly, learned what his wife's shifts used to cost her body. He didn't speak to her much anymore. There wasn't much left to say that either of them wanted to hear. The divorce had finalized quietly in the 4th month. No drama, no lawyers shouting in hallways, just 2 signatures and the strange, anticlimactic relief of watching a door close that had been half open for years. He had, to his credit, stopped mocking her. It's difficult to look down on someone from the loading dock. The scholarship program had grown to 510 students across 3 countries by the time Amara stood at the ribbon cutting for the second shelter. This one not in Osaka, but in Freetown, 4 blocks from the neighborhood where Auntie Blessing had once taken in a grieving orphan, the way some people take in stray cats, grudgingly and then completely. Auntie Blessing herself sat in the front row in her best church dress, 83 years old and still sharp enough to heckle the mayor's speech under her breath. And when Amara caught her eye across the crowd, the old woman simply nodded the way she used to nod over a well-finished seam. Good work, girl. Good work. Takeda stood beside Amara that day, no longer flanked by 5 men in dark suits, just one quiet driver waiting at a respectful distance. He'd learned over 7 months that his sister didn't need armed protection so much as she needed someone to show up. That was a harder lesson for a man like him, and he'd taken to it with the same relentless discipline he brought to everything else. You know, he said, watching a girl of maybe 11 accept her scholarship certificate with shaking hands, unable to stop smiling. I used to think I owed you a debt I could never repay. Money, protection, power. I threw all of it at the idea of you for 12 years, because it was the only currency I understood. And now? Amara asked. Now I think you never wanted repayment, he said. You just wanted someone to notice. So I've stopped trying to pay a debt. I'm just trying to be worth noticing. Amara smiled, the bracelet, hers, and its twin on his wrist, catching the Freetown sun as she reached for his hand. She thought of the lobby 7 months ago, of Derek's laugh, of a room full of strangers who'd assumed a maid's whole worth could be measured by her uniform. She thought of a river of rising water, of a boy who had grown into a man who bowed to her in front of everyone who'd ever underestimated her. She had lost a husband who called her nothing. She had gained a brother who called her family. A system that finally protected women who looked like her, and 510 children who would never have to learn the way she once had. That kindness goes unrewarded. It hadn't. In the end, it never did.